And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you tonight with Jeff Grupp. We are going to be talking about simulated universes, infinite universes, spirituality. Is there indeed a God? Let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. He's been a pastor at a jail in Michigan, a former atheist, a former Buddhist, and a former college lecturer in philosophy at Grand Valley at Western Michigan. Purdue branches campuses in Indiana used as well, where he taught philosophy, and more specifically, Eastern philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, and Buddhism. Jeff, welcome back. This is fascinating. I'm looking forward to this with you.
Hey, George, great to talk to you again. Great to hear your voice. You're a great person and definitely an inspiration.
How have you been? You doing okay?
Yeah, really good, better than ever. Really, just living sort of on the edge in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
With in the jail ministry, and it's just there's nothing better.
Michigan's my home state. What spot here are you in Michigan?
Well, I used to teach at U of Michigan Dearborn, which I know is
that's right.
Stopping grounds.
Exactly.
And, I thought that was one of there in University of Detroit are the last two places I taught at. And I live in Kalamazoo now and have for a number of years. This is actually my hometown, coming back to where I went to high school, and so forth. So it's just great to be back. I love this part of the country. And
UAD is where I got my college degree. Great university.
Yep, definitely. I loved teaching there while I was there.
How were you an atheist and then you've become such a believer? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot myself.
Huh.
I became real angry in high school. I thought the system was a lie. I thought people were liars. I thought, everybody was pressuring me to I think when I talked about this in January 2019 in your show, and I remember I had pressure to become an engineer, computer scientist, attorney, all these things I didn't want to do, and I became real angry in high school. And sort of, I met a woman that I absolutely fell in love with. I'm still married to her now, 30 years.
Beautiful.
And we just kind of ran off and went to live in New Mexico, and I became real angry and hateful towards my upbringing. And part of that was the churches I was raised in. I just really lashed out and I kind of thought that the churches had something to do with God, which I've now learned is really not so much the case in so many instances. And I rejected God. Well, at least I thought I did. There's an argument that all people actually are seeking God and don't know it. That's the Bible verse, Mark 1:37. I just made a short film on my website about that, praiseandlove.net. And all people are. I believe. I would think back to my time when I was an atheist, and I know that deep down, at the core of my soul, I was interacting with God. I was rejecting Him. I was telling Him I hated Him, telling Him I was angry at Him, that I hated my life, and I blamed Him. I was very suicidal for many years, all the way really up until about 35, when I did turn to Christianity. I'm 51 now, and those interactions with God, though, pushing Him away, putting my hand out to Him, get away from me, and so forth. Those are all, instances of touching God. And when anybody who touches God starts to become like Him, that's 1 John 3:2. And even the angry atheist out there, whether they know it or not, is the deep level of their soul is interacting with their Creator, and that's. We can't look to the two religions I've been a part of in my life, Buddhism and Christianity. I was a very, very dedicated Buddhist until 35 when I turned to Christianity. And Buddhism actually helped me a lot, even though I had great troubles being suicidal and lots of other things going on until I was 35. And I think both of those religions are, in my opinion, I think they're very similar religions as you and I have discussed in the past. And I think they're both talking about, there's this infinite energy, supernatural energy everywhere, this light that's creating all things, that we're interacting with whether we know it or not, at the deep level of our souls. And it's composed of absolute ecstasy and joy. And I think everybody listening, especially this audience, George.
Absolutely.
This audience is, us all gathering here tonight is sort of like this, elevated consciousness, where all these people.
Wait till we open up the phone lines, Jeff. Wow.
Yeah. Been there, done that on this show. Everybody sort of wants to break down the walls, and get past all the garbage and get to the truth on this show. And that's really where joy comes from. That's really what we all have to do, or else we're going to have emptiness and misery. So anyway, to answer your question, it was really misguided thinking that people that were cruel to me from churches and so forth as a kid had something to do with God, made me turn against God. And then it was finally until he showed me his supernatural. I'm a Christian, so I say his. But if somebody's not, use whatever,
sure,
infinite light, whatever you want to say. I don't have anything against. I hold the position of Christian universalism, where all people are saved at the end of the world, and that's very clear to me that the Bible is talking about that. We can talk about that later, but the Bible predicts that the churches at the end of the world go on the wrong track. Galatians 1:6 says they preach a different gospel, and so forth. I think we're seeing a lot of that now, and that's what largely made me become an atheist. And it wasn't until I had direct interaction with God, which I had been happening a bit while I was an atheist. God started working in me while I was an atheist. I was sort of this really empty, unhappy, miserable, very mean person up until about 35. But there would be these moments, George, where I would have incredible joy, rapture, ecstasy. I remember this one instance. I was in Walmart, and I saw this really deformed, I don't know if it was a child. I think maybe like a high school age child. One of those situations where normally you'd find yourself, reacting with a grotesque reaction, seeing the deformed person. But I remember it was like the light of God just came over me, and I felt this incredible love, which didn't make any sense. I remember being baffled afterwards. It was like I was just transported into just this transcendence, this ecstasy. I remember sitting there walking through Walmart, thinking, I want to help this person. What can I want to give my life to them. I'm like all these crazy thoughts. And I had started having instances like that until I became a Christian. And it was really Buddhism, I think. I thought it was like a two-step, Buddhism and Christianity, sort of two sides of a coin, and one leading to the other. And Buddhism really opened me up and broke down a lot of the atheism in me. We all, my take, we all have to be open to the infinite Creator everywhere, or else we're in big trouble. We're going to give in to the empty forms of this world, which will not deliver happiness to us.
Was it gradual for you to become the believer, or did it just happen like overnight?
Well, no, it was both. It was extremely. It had to do with my wife getting in a car crash, and there's a whole story behind that. I discussed that in your show in January 2019, and I had some visions about it and dreams and so forth. God was telling me it was going to happen. It was a very sort of a crazy time, and God was doing this, working through me like I just described. But then when this car crash happened, I actually saw an angel. I don't know if you remember that from me talking about that in January.
I do, yeah. We've got a lot of new listeners, though, who haven't heard your stories, no. So go ahead.
It was that direct vision. It told me without words, I'm a messenger from Christ. And there's a whole big story behind that. The nature of this angel, what it looks like, how it approached me, and so forth, that I became an instant believer at that point, but then later realized God had been working within me sporadically for at least 10 years before.
Wow. All of them. Mm-hmm. What do you say to skeptics now, Jeff, who tell you, I'm not a believer? What do you tell them?
Oh, yeah. I say, well, either one or two things. Yeah, that's a great question. That happens all the time at the jail, every single week. And I just say, well, you haven't experienced God. I was having a debate on YouTube with an atheist just the other day, and they were really attacking one of my videos, saying you're just, living in your dream, fantasy land, fairy tale, religion, coping mechanism, blah, blah, blah. And I said, and then finally they revealed, they said, well, I did what you did for 30 years trying to find God, and there is no God. And I pointed out that was, of course, a logical contradiction. But I said, more importantly, well, wait a minute. So you've never had experience of God. Well, of course you're not going to believe if you've never had experience of God. Why would you believe something just because somebody tells you should have experience of God, just like all the people in the Bible, for example, do? So many. I mean, they would have, like Paul on the road to Damascus, he would have experience of God and then believe. I mean, that's where so what I tell skeptics, I say, is you need to reach out, open up your heart, break down the walls, and reach out to the infinite Creator that's all around you, everywhere, and have direct contact with Him, and then you will know, and you don't have to wonder, and until you're at that point, you really don't have any reason to believe. And then there's a whole second part of this where I can describe to them, how exactly you have direct contact with God, and which is a state of spiritual ecstasy, which there's nothing better than that. That's what the point of all of our lives are for. Are
you there to convince the skeptic or just to enlighten them?
Maybe enlightened, but I mean, I'm a Calvinist. Really, it's called a Calvinist Universalist. My website, CalvinistUniversalism.net, describes a lot about that. And in Calvinism, you really hold, like it says in Revelation 4:11, that God creates all things. He's in control of everything. I don't need to sit and try to sell people, convince people of God. I don't need to do it. God does all that. All I have to do is just be filled with His Spirit, with His light, and overflowing with joy, and then just go interact with people, and He does all the work. Isaiah 26:12 says He does all our works, and I don't need to sit there and worry about being a salesman. Whenever you see Christians doing that, I just say you're really missing the boat. Why don't you go take the plank out of your own eye, worry about your own life, and get high on your Creator before trying to fix all these other people, and so forth. So no, I don't really do any convincing. That does happen, convincing, but God does all that through me. I don't do any of it.
I'm on a mission personally, Jeff, to get answers. I mean, I want answers about the universe, about after death. I mean, I can't stop. I mean, I'm fixated on trying to get answers, and that's one of the things that keeps pushing me and pushing me and pushing me.
Mm-hmm. Same here. Yeah, there's really no other point. I mean, we live in a world where we're sort of tricked into following these empty forms. The brainwashing TV. We're supposed to be in fear of all these things, and we're supposed to be all obsessed with this and that and everything, all these other things we hear. And I just have turned my back on all of it. I don't. The other day there was a big shootout here in Kalamazoo, and the police demolished a house. This just happened the other day, and a guy that got out of jail recently that we helped find a house. He was homeless. We got him a house. It was just a gift of God. It was an absolute miracle that it really incredibly overwhelming, joyful situation of this brother getting this house. But anyway, it was right next to him, and he moves in. There's this huge shootout. Anybody can look it up on the news.
Oh,
and I didn't even know about it. And he was texting me saying, wow, there's a big shootout, 17-hour long, right next to my house. And he couldn't believe I didn't know. And I said, well, I'm not going to use my time for those empty forms. It's the forms of the world wage war against the soul. 1 Peter 2:11 says that. And people don't really understand how that equation right there. You have to take the model of someone like St. Francis of Assisi, for example. He's someone I've really become obsessed with over the last number of years. He follows directly from Jesus. Turning his back on possessions, living in squalor, becoming homeless, serving those who have nothing, being himself nothing. This world, George, people simply don't know how real God is and the ways to get in contact with Him. We live in this fog of days of a dream in this civilization where people are tantalized by really visual images, screens and rumor and all kinds of unverifiable information or meaningless information, which fills us all with emptiness, and we all wonder why we're feeling such lack of meaning. The meaning is not in this world. Meaning is only in the infinite Creator, God, that is everywhere. That's my experiences have led me to that, and I don't. The world is teaching us to do the exact opposite of what we need to do to have spiritual ecstasy.
Jeff, was it Elon Musk who came up with this simulated theory idea?
No, it was not him. It was Nick Bostrom, and Nick Bostrom kind of even a couple people like Moravec and even really Philip K. Dick, the science fiction guy, before him, and then really even Descartes, back to the philosopher from the Renaissance, or really Enlightenment. Elon Musk has popularized a certain version of what's called simulation theory, and that's the idea that all of you listening right now, that your consciousness is a simulation implanted into you by some other being.
By something, yeah.
Yep, yeah, it's not, you think the world is giving you your experiences, but really it's just a TV show, so to speak, being implanted into your consciousness. And George, we can talk about this, and what we're going to show here is that simply just a fact that that's what's going on. And there's people are either elated by this idea, or they strongly reject it really violently.
I hate it. It bothers the heck out of me.
Yeah. Right. It is. Well, so we'll talk a lot about that. But Elon Musk has really popularized a very specific sort of it, which has sort of taken over the world. And I think there's probably 1 billion people that are aware of this idea because of him. Was Nick Bostrom of Oxford University came out with what he calls the simulation hypothesis. I cite that. So I've recently published. So I used to teach, and I published quite a bit. I haven't published for a few years, but the 3 biggest pieces of academic work, discovery, breakthrough that I've ever done have happened in the last 2 years, and that's my book, God Faith, really chapters 1, 2, and 4 are just, I just think, for me, have been incredible breakthrough. And I've had people emailing me telling me the same thing, especially chapter 1 and 4. And then also, I've published 2 academic papers this year, George. One is called The Implantation Argument, which I think is linked on your site right now.
Yep.
And that's a new proof for the existence of God, and God is the creator of all simulations. And that's a direct attack on the Elon Musk simulation theory, which we'll go over in just a minute, what the problem is with that simulation theory. And then the other one I published is really more a straight theological, philosophical article on infinite universes and salvation, why God chooses only some initially, and then at the end of the world he saves all people, which is the exact message that's in the Bible, exact message which was in the early church, first 300-400 years of the church, but which has not been the message of the church really since Augustine. And unfortunately, the Catholic Church really just ran with it, and they promote this idea of an eternal hell, which people never get out of. Now, there is discussion in a few verses in the Bible about eternal hell, but people never talk about the other side of the story that, yes, people are put in eternal hell, and God plucks them out. It's a baptism. Luke 3, verse 16 is a baptism of fire. God uses it to save people. And, I know a lot of your listeners right now maybe know about this, maybe some others don't, and they're falling off their chair right now, but the verses are simply there. The church has been corrupted. This was prophesied all over the New Testament, really even in the last third of the Old Testament, all over the place as well. Its prophecy has been realized. We're near the end of the world, which I'm happy about. The end of the world is not going to be it's going to be horrific in ways, but for those who are chosen before the fire at the end of the world, it's going to be a time of incredible increasing joy, elation, ecstasy in the Spirit of God. And those who are not chosen, yes, it's going to be rough, it's going to be ugly, and there's a reason why some are chosen and some are not before. That's what that other paper that I published in a journal called Philosophy and Theology from Marquette University. The title of the paper is Why God Only Chose Some, which is also linked on your website.
And you've got a couple books out there too, don't you?
Well, yeah, the big one,
God Faith.
I do. They're all on my website, but really God Faith is the one that I'm so these 3 publications, God Faith and then these 2 articles, have really sort of left me in a spiritual high over the last few years. I've had, I'm blessed that God has revealed him to me directly, his infinite light. Any of us really are having that happen deep within us, whether we know it or not, right now, as the Bible tells us. But those 3 publications have really given sort of, for me at least, sort of a lucid way of describing things about God that are just really exciting and joyful about how it really is, about how we're all being saved, about how his ecstatic light is interacting with us and saving us. And it's all we have to do is, there's certain techniques we can just do to touch it, be one with it.
Hold on, Jeff. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and pick it up right there as we talk about the simulation possibility and much more coming up on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Pastor Jeff Grupp, as we are talking about his work and his thoughts as a simulated universe. His websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com. One of his books includes God Faith, Discovering the Pure Logic Built into the Fabric of Reality. Jeff, what do you mean by a term mind screen?
Yeah, that's a term that I got from Film Studies, a book on Ingmar Bergman that I read, Princeton University Press. I think it's called Mind Screen, sitting right behind me in my office here. But that is a term I use to describe the simulated consciousness, which is what all of you are. If the simulation theory is true, George, you, me, anybody listening, is a simulation consciousness. I call it a mind screen. So you're a mind, and your mind is presented to you as a screen of visualization. And it's got sound, it has feeling, it has moving color images with all these different shapes and predictable patterns and so forth. And your mind is a screen, and mind screen is that's all anybody listening has ever known. And for all you know, that is all that reality is. And the article that I just published in the journal, the professional academic philosophy journal Metaphysica, volume 22, number 2, says that that's all that can exist are mind screens and or point-sized, what are called philosophical atoms, which are the true basic building blocks of reality. which are little points of energy that have no size, which is actually, believe it or not, George, has been the standard position in quantum physics really up until string theory, which I'm a kind of an opponent of string theory. I think it's just a philosophy. It's not really a science. It's a mathematical philosophy that really can't be proven or disproven. And up until then, we had what was called the standard model of quantum physics, which involved the scientific finding that particles are points. And so that leads directly to simulation theory. If everything's a point with no size, then how are we experiencing all this stuff? Because everything would be invisible. Something with no size is invisible. It doesn't have a surface, doesn't have a color. But all we see is surfaces and colors in our mind screen. So we've got a big disconnect here between reality and what we experience as reality. This is kind of a basis for part of the article that I wrote, and it indicates that people, like we've talked about earlier, people want to resist the idea of simulation theory. Let me speak to that real quick, and then let's talk about Musk and Bostrom's, what's wrong with their simulation hypothesis, which has been spread all over the world. And I think the reason people often, this is not to implicate anybody, I mean, this happens a little bit with me too, the reason there's resistance to simulation theory is because it's like a sort of dying, because all we know is the world, and people assume that if reality is a simulation, then everything we see around us is not real, which is simply not true. Everything you see around you is real. It's just that it's a state of consciousness, not a mind-independent set of shapes and matter objects outside of you. In other words, you go through your whole life without knowing there's a simulated reality, and if somebody listening to the show tonight wakes up to that there's a simulated reality, it's not like they're going to go through their whole day tomorrow thinking there's a simulated reality. They're going to still go as if everything is mind independent of them. There's this external reality. However, George, if someone does go through their moment-to-moment life realizing everything is a simulated reality, they will fall into a state of spiritual ecstasy. Now, why is that the case? Well, we already cited the verse 1 Peter 2:11, where the lust of the flesh wage war against the soul, and there's also another verse, James 4:4. Those who are friends of the world are enemies of God. What this all means is that for some reason, which is, it takes some explaining, when one focuses their mind away from God and focuses it on other things, such as the world, it leads to emptiness. It leads to consciousness which is not filled with God, which is a consciousness which does not have joy, which, according to the Bible, the only source of joy is God. So you're going to be focusing your consciousness on things where joy is not. So therefore, you get the expected results. We live in a culture of addiction, desperation, emptiness, people going from, addiction to addiction, where addiction can be TV and beer. It can be your job. It can be your own personality. It doesn't have to be. A lot of people in the jail I work at have been hooked on methamphetamine, which is sort of the most extreme drug in our culture, sort of a I would say a satanic plague that's all over the place right now. But so to get to the point, the addiction of the world, rather than rejecting the world and looking past it to the creator of the world, the one who's in all things but not of all things, which is God, Jesus, that right there is the reason that I think simulation theory often, when people stumble across it, it's like dying to what you've always known. Now, but like I said, there is a flip side to it, that it does lead to a state of spiritual ecstasy. In fact, in some of I talk about what's called omnipresence prayer.
Mm-hmm.
I've got some sermons I've done on that, and I talk about that. That's sort of a main ministry theme that comes up in the jail every single week, frequently, because I'm in the jail quite a bit, and it's always being discussed. Now, I don't usually call it omnipresence prayer. I just call it true prayer, and that's when you actually look at God. Now, most people, I think you can have whole churches full of 500 people who are sitting there all praying, and nobody's looking at God. And now, if people listening,
they might not know what to look for.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not saying they're bad people or dumb or something. It's just you got to think about it. Like when I talk to you, George, my consciousness is going to intermittently be literally pointing at you, and to talk to God, we have to do the exact same thing. Our consciousness literally has to point at Him. The Bible talks about this, Acts 16:30, 31, John 17:3, all over the place. And, you know, people talking directly to God, what they're doing is looking at God. Hebrews 12:2 says, fix your eyes on Jesus. So when we look at God, we're going to be in a state of absolute overwhelmedness, in a state of joy, ecstasy, incredible peace, elation, and so forth. It's just simply an automatic result. Even if we're in the valley of the shadow of death, we're going to be also on the mountaintop in what I call the Jesus high or a God high. And this is what really everybody in the world needs, and it's what I think what everybody wants. And everybody's restless and miserable until they get it. That's my opinion. And this is really what's taught in the jail. Now, I don't really use these terms. I usually use Bible verses in the jail, but this is essentially the message of what I call omnipresence prayer, which is praying, you know, looking out into your reality, knowing that God is in all things, pointing your mind right at Him, believing Him with perfect lack of, you know, non-doubt. Doubt is the ultimate enemy of prayer. If I doubted I was talking to you right now, George, I'd kind of be a little bit psychotic, you know, because you know.
Is it possible though, Jeff, that mankind created God because they can't comprehend how life started? So as an excuse.
Then where did everything come from? I mean,
I agree with you. I'm just playing the devil's advocate for a moment.
I don't think it's possible. The first chapter of my book, God Faith, talks about a new, what I call a new proof for the existence of God. I can sum it up really easily here.
Please.
Look at everybody look inside your consciousness. You've got things like feelings and thoughts, for example. What are these things? These, especially feelings, they don't look like bricks. They don't look like wood and rock. They don't look like anything physical. And I bet you most people out there are going to say it's spiritual. Even atheist philosophers will say, oh, yeah, our consciousness appears as if it's spiritual. Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, if you're looking at it and it's spiritual, then it is spiritual. So your mind is a spirit. And that's exactly what the Bible says. You know, we are spirits created in God's image, and God's a spirit, John 4:24. So the point is if we're a spirit, then if our inner minds are who we really are, and that it says in the Bible in 1 Samuel 16:7 that when God looks at us, He looks at us, our inside, our spirit, our real self. So if we're a spirit, then we're created by only a spirit can create another spirit. So we're created by spirit, and then so you wonder, okay, well, what's the spirit that's created us? And then the spirit would have to tell you who it is. They have to give you its name, and it says in the Bible, God refers to His name as being I am that I am. And what's your name, George? Your name is I am. My name is I am. Everybody refers to himself as an I am. Mm-hmm. We all have the same name, and it's half of God's name. We all share half of the same name as God. God is simply telling us that I'm the Spirit who has created you, which are all spirits. That's kind of a summary of chapter 1 of my book, God Faith.
Well, if I had asked you the same question when you were an atheist, how would you have answered it?
This is a fun, George, this literally, when I was 35 years old, I published an article called Mereological Nihilism in the journal Axiomates when I was still teaching, and this I used to say this was my big breakout article, but now I think the more recent stuff I've published is. But that article led to what I just said, that consciousness cannot be an aspect of the physical world. This is an academic article.
Mm-hmm.
It was 175 pages, really like a PhD dissertation, and I led to these conclusions here that mind cannot be physical. Now, there's a huge backlash against this in academia. This is also discussed heavily in my book, God Faith, Chapter 1, where everyone wants to say that consciousness is brain tissue, brain systems, neurons, and that simply is not possible. Because if I look at my consciousness, look at a feeling, I do not see brain tissue. I do not see neurons. It's something fundamentally different, of a different order of stuff, different order of reality than brain tissue. It's it's spiritual. It looks like it's spiritual when I look at it, just like the Bible says. And I don't know how, and there's, like Trenton Merrick's, for example, is a really interesting philosopher who writes on a lot of the same things that I have. I think where does he teach? Rutgers or something? I forgot. I should know. I forgot. But he's also written on the same thing. Like, you look at consciousness and you look at brain, and the two simply appear to be on different sides of the street. How do you link one to the other? If I'm looking at a visual image in my, so my mind screen, my consciousness has a visual image like it does right now. I'm looking at my computer screen, but the image is actually inside my consciousness. I believe it's out there, but it's actually in my mind. where is the TV screen of this visual image in my head? George, if there's a TV screen in my head, I've got a serious problem, a medical emergency. I need to get to the hospital. There is no TV screen in my head.
Finish the show first, then go to the hospital. Okay?
Pardon?
Finish the show first, then go to the hospital.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. So I mean, there is. If you can look all over. Now there's a guy named Jack Gallant who says that he's discovering, patterns like visual images in the primary visual cortex of the brain. I discussed that in the last chapter of God, Faith, and I just simply show that it's absolutely false, and it's very easy to refute that and show that it's just based on inept research, but which we can go into later. But just wanted to at least mention that. So yeah, there's this huge draw. If academics all over the world suddenly said, "Yep, okay, we agree. Let's just take everything for exactly what it looks like. Consciousness looks spiritual, so therefore it is." George, what you have then is you would have a worldwide revolution which would point straight to the existence of a supernatural creator that has created all of our consciousnesses. We'd all look at ourselves as being created, not as coming from being animals or something. I'm not saying we're not animals, but we're animals with a supernatural ghost inside of us. And we'd all look at ourselves that way, and it would lead to an incredible elevation of consciousness everywhere. But unfortunately, academia is going on this completely non-evidential thesis that brain is simply consciousness is reducible to brain, which nobody has an argument for that. It's all I discussed that heavily in Chapter 1, and it just simply doesn't work. So, do you want to discuss the Elon Musk Bostrom?
Yeah, that's especially the Musk thing, because that's the most current.
Yeah. So, Elon Musk, he is really just taking word for word Nick Bostrom's of Oxford University. Elon Musk should do, if he ever hears the show, you should do a little bit better job citing your source there, because Bostrom gets the credit for that. It's a pretty remarkable paper.
When did he come out and say that? Nick did.
Bostrom's article is probably 20 years old now.
That long? Okay.
Yeah, he's been on, I think, Joe Rogan, and he's pretty. It's pretty well known. But Musk has really taken it over and popularized, which is kind of I like that. But here's the thing, though, George. The article I just published in Metaphysica on simulation that says God is the creator of simulations points out what I think is clearly a fatal flaw. And let's discuss that. That simulation theory has to be incorrect, and here's why. So what that simulation theory involves is the idea that information in our world right now, George, is increasing unbelievably. 100 years ago there's no computers, and now we've got all the supercomputers in our pockets, these cell phones, and and it's integrating with our bodies. And what's next?
That's true.
We're going to have super consciousnesses soon. So what they say is, with the incredible elevation of information and technology, soon there'll be creatures in our world that can create simulations, and they've got reasons to say they'll create way more simulations than there are actual people, and so therefore it's more likely that you in fact are a simulation than not a simulation. Now here's the problem with it. It sounds like, wow, that really makes
it's bizarre.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a straightforward, remarkable argument until you realize one huge fatal problem, and that's this, George. The argument is using the elements of the simulation to make conclusions about what's outside the simulation. Let me explain that in simpler terms. Now, what they're saying is that so our minds are a simulation, and in this simulation we see what's called civilization, and civilization is escalating towards being a super advanced civilization and beyond. Now that's all locked into the simulation, okay? But what they do is they say that no, that actually tells us what's outside the simulation, that there is actually creatures outside the simulation doing that to us. Now, creating our minds as simulations, so there's super advanced civilizations creating our consciousnesses, and we're simulations. Now, the question is very obvious. I don't think anybody's pointed this out before for some reason, at least not academia. And that's the question: is how do we know that just because in our simulated consciousness there are these ideas like civilization and advanced beings and advanced civilization and so forth, that's what things are like outside of our consciousness, outside the simulation? And the answer is there's absolutely no reason to think that, and reality could be radically different and beyond our imagination, nothing like we even imagine. And I give some specific examples in this article I just published of how that might look of creatures and beings and so forth would be completely different. So there's no way that things have to be like we think they are in our simulated consciousness outside the simulation. So that's a fatal flaw. It's kind of like going real simple. It's kind of like this, George. It's like saying in my simulated consciousness, which is, I'm locked into, I see apples.
All right, hold on, Jeff. Let's talk more about that when we come back. And we'll take phone calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. George Norrie with you, along with Pastor Jeff Grupp. Jeff, I'll let you finish up your thoughts on the simulation, and then I want to ask you about the multiverses, and then we'll take calls. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I'm glad, because I was right at the end. What Bostrom is doing, then the Bostrom-Musk simulation theory, is they're essentially doing this. They're saying, in my simulated consciousness, I see, for example, apples. And so therefore, since I see them in my consciousness, I know that they're therefore outside of my simulated consciousness. Now, you can't make that jump. And then what they do is they say, okay, since I know they're also outside my consciousness, then I know that. Then they make a whole bunch of other conclusions based on that. You simply can't do that jump. That leads to what's in philosophy is called the reification fallacy, or the reification critical thinking fallacy, which is a contradiction. And if you sit and think about what Bostrom and Musk, their simulation theory involves, it simply involves reification fallacy. It has to be wrong. Now, in 20 seconds, the simulation theory that I've been developing for the last 10 years basically just builds on what the ancient Greeks did, and that reality around us is a contradiction. I discussed this in August 2015 with you, George, on Coast to Coast, which that show was, I thought that was a really good show.
Classic.
And that everywhere we look, everywhere, and this is well known in philosophy for 2,700 years, that this reality is only describable in terms of contradiction. Now, usually what philosophers and scientists say is that, okay, we know there's contradiction everywhere. What we must just not understand things well, so we want to try to come across better theory, better experiments, so we can understand reality as non-contradictory, which it is. But they never, in 2,700 years, nobody's done that. It's just led to more and more discovery of the contradiction that's describable everywhere. So it's better reality can't be described by a contradiction, only if you say it doesn't exist outside of us, mind independently, but it's just the mind screen consciousness implanted in us by God. Just all of a sudden, reality become coherent. Now, I could talk about this for 3 hours. There's a whole much more to this, but that's in general the quickest possible summary of what's going on with Bostrom, the Bostrom-Musk, the problem with their simulation theory, and what I would say is the real simulation theory, which is simply just that God is in control of all things. And if he's in control of all things, like it says in Luke 11:40, he's also creating your inner mind. And if he's creating your inner mind, then the world isn't. You can't have two things creating the same thing. You only need one. And if God's in control and he's creating all things, the world isn't, and God is implanting all of our consciousnesses right now. And there's actually a way to even describe it. We all know that all of us, it's not like we exist alone. We all exist together, and we're not interacting through the world. We're interacting through God's simulation.
Now, let's get your thoughts on the multiverse. Do you really believe they all exist?
Okay, so there's two ways to think about infinite universes. And one is in terms of the simulation. So we have this simulation mind screen that we live through, this reality that we all see, filled with things, trees and stars and other people and so forth. Now, in that aspect of reality, there has to be infinite. I mean, that mind screen theater that we all live in terms of the simulation would involve infinite universes. For example, if there can never be a point where let's say I point my finger at into the air right now. I'm doing it right now. I'm pointing in a direction. It has to be the case that in that direction to an infinite distance is reality, existence. There's never a point where it stops and then we reach nothingness and there's like a wall, the end of the universe, or the end of the universes, and then beyond it is nothingness. There has to always be existence. So that would, now there's a whole bunch of reasons for that we can go. First of all, the concept of nothingness really kind of is impossible. It doesn't make any sense. And all the way back to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, they were talking about these very issues. Philosophers like Leucippus, Democritus, some of the ancient atomists, really amazing, enlightened people. And they came up with arguments like, for example, if I go to the edge of the universe and if I shoot my arrow into the edge of the universe, does it get repelled backwards? And then they say that's not possible because the only thing that would be doing the repelling is nothingness. if there's nothing beyond the universe, it's just pure, like absolute non-existence, not just empty space or something, but nothing. You can't even say anything about it. There's nothing there to say anything about. But nothingness can't push back an arrow. It can't do work like that. So there can't be an edge of the universe where there's nothing beyond it. There has to be another universe or more existence or something. They came up with all these amazing arguments like that, which indicate that our reality is infinite. Now, there's a whole bunch of other ways. The Bible. I talk about this in my book, God, Faith. I think it's page 84 and 85. I come up with a logical argument which shows that the Christian God, simply through a set of Bible verses, you can also simply deduce that the Christian God is a creator of infinite worlds, infinite universes, and that leads to a whole bunch of theological discoveries, which really solve this other article that I published called Why God Only Shows Some in Philosophy and Theology that I published this year. That really, the idea that God is the creator of infinite universes and infinite souls, which is the other side of the infinite universe question, which I'll get to in a second, that solves a whole set of philosophical and theological problems that nobody's really been able to solve. John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Wesley, Augustine, all these people have talked about, why is there evil? Why does God save some, not others? All these things are actually solved if you just admit that God is a creator of infinities. He doesn't create one universe. He creates infinite universes. I can go through that argument in biblical terms, but maybe let me just go to the other side of the simulation theory.
Sure.
Now, the other side of it is that this is a little more, I think, exact and precise. The article I just published on simulation theory would come to the conclusion that the only types of things that exist in reality are energy points, what are called philosophic atoms, point-sized basic building blocks of reality, and minds, and then a creator of those things. Really, there might just be those three things that exist. And there's a whole bunch of very specific logical arguments and so forth, which really align pretty well with things like quantum physics, remarkably well. And so on that thesis, there would be what we could say are infinite mind screens. Like all of us are a mind screen, and God will create infinite of them from eternity to eternity, and all of them are being saved. God is implanting His Spirit into them to save them all. They're all created in corruption. That's why our world is such a disaster, such a mess, because God is a perfect creator. It talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15:42, and there's a number of other verses as well. But God is the one perfect. There only can be one perfect. There can't be two absolute perfects. What is perfect can't be improved upon, can't be added to. You can't do anything to make it better. It's perfectly complete. You can't do anything to make it more complete. There's only one of those. There can't be two. So if God does match that description, anything He creates would be imperfect. And that's why you have our world is being such a disaster. And there's a large philosophy connected to what I'm talking about right here, which part of it is in that article I just referred to that I published. And what the point of our lives is God is in the process of purifying us, really through fire, which is a large theme in the Bible, which is almost never discussed in churches. Look at Luke 3 verse 6, 3 verse 16, Amos 4, 12, 11, 12, 13, all over the place. I won't give a bunch of verses, but and He's purifying all of us to save us and to put His Spirit into us to be saved for eternity. And that's the case for every single person. And the Bible is unmistakably clear on that. The churches are incorrect in saying that there's some that are in, and they're so lucky, and then some that are out there literally going to get burned in hell in screaming torment forever by this all-loving God and never taken out of that. That's just a ridiculous idea. So many Christians struggle with that, and I just say to them, look, it's not even what the Bible says anyways. So anyway, back to the point of simulation theory. The most precise way I think to describe our reality is a set of infinite souls that created by God, interacting with each other first through a simulation of a reality. In ours, it's what we call this physical reality. Other worlds might have different kinds of realities they interact through, and then all of which are being saved to live in direct presence of God forever. So those would be the two ways of describing infinite universe theory.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, though, you do not believe in the simulation theory, do you?
Oh no, I absolutely. I don't know why you got that. I absolutely do. I think it's inescapable.
You
especially
do.
with verses like
Okay.
Luke 11:40. I mean, if God is creating my consciousness, then He is implanting all my conscious contents right now. And as you also, George, it just seems like, at least at this point of reality, that that there's an outside world that's creating my consciousness, but that's just part of what called the mind screen simulation. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why God would do that. But then eventually they'll be in the state of eternity in heaven, which in the new earth, God will directly interact with us, shine His face on us, shine His light on us, and that will be our existence, living in the infinity of God forever.
Let's go to the phones now. David in Columbus, Ohio. David, welcome to the program.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dave.
I'd like to ask your guest, when does he think the rapture will occur? I don't know about anybody else, but I sure don't want to be left behind, because after the rapture, that's when the Antichrist comes into the world.
Get your take on the rapture, Jeffrey. Jeff? We need to call Jeff back. One more try first. Jeff, you there? Nope, we'll get him back. Give him a call, Jeremiah, get him back online. And but the rapture, well, if you believe in the book of Revelation right at the end, anything could happen. Anything could happen. But we'll get his take on it because he is the expert on that. And let's go to Walt. Let's go to Walton. Walt, I have a feeling I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
George, with all due respect to the pastor, he said he was an atheist at one time, but I don't think he ever was, because he said when he was an atheist that he rejected or he was angry with God. Now, you can't be angry with something that doesn't exist, George. Now, as I've said in the past, the Bible and all of these other holy books are, George, they're replete with anthropomorphism. It's obvious to me that they were concocted in man's imagination. Now, one of the most obvious and prominent anthropomorphisms of all is the idea of a Messiah.
All right, well, we got Jeff back. Jeff, a couple of questions came in while we were getting you back on. One is your thoughts on the rapture. When could it occur?
Yeah, sorry about the disconnect. I don't know what happened there. Okay, rapture is a huge topic with me. I used to not really think we were in the end times a couple years ago. Now I do, not just because of the pandemic, but for a whole host of things that have happened, such as Donald Trump's, when he was starting to set up those peace agreements with countries surrounding Israel. And there was also not only a pandemic recently, but there was also a global famine. The earthquakes are on the rise. There's a whole host of reasons which are discussed in Matthew 24, verses like 4, 5, 6, 7. But rapture, I've got a couple things on my website. My website is called Praise and Love. You can get to it through my website, praiseandlove.net. And I've got a number of shows on the end times, real specific signs that are going on that not that many people are seeing. It's all kind of happening outside of people's view because it takes the non-believers by like as a thief in the night. So anyway, I think it's a real specific example of when time when the rapture is going to be completed. I think it's going on a little bit now, and it's not like a day long. It happens some afternoon where we're all floating up in our shoes or something. I think that's more of a Hollywood idea and not really a biblical idea. But to answer this caller's question, that rapture has to be complete during the implementation of the mark of the beast, because Revelation 13 talks about how everybody will be forced to take the mark by the Antichrist, and Revelation 14 says that no believer will take the mark. So if you put those two concepts together, and it also talks in, I think it's Revelation 17 or 18, about how there's many believers who get beheaded for not taking the mark. So if you put all this together, we know that the rapture must be completed during the time of the implementation of the mark of the beast, which I personally think that the vaccine is a sort of warm-up, getting everybody ready.
I was just going to ask you about the vaccine and whether that could be the mark of the beast.
No, I don't think it's the mark. I think the Bible always talks about warm-ups. Like Mount Sinai, for example, with Moses was like a warm-up, like a fractal of the big time, where God reveals himself to the whole world. There's all these like fractal instances, and you can even notice this in your personal life with your interactions with God. It's always a fractal, like he'll interact with you gradually, instances, and then boom. He does the same thing with the whole world, and I think the vaccine is just a warm-up, getting everybody ready to this idea that we have to do these weird things like, inject ourselves with chemicals. I mean, really, let me tell you a story, George. Really, just take a second. I don't want to say anything against the vaccine. I don't want to get on that boat. I don't really want to talk about that. But what I do want to say is I just want to tell a story. In the jail, I've had some you were talking about veterans last hour. And
Yeah.
I just was thinking while I was listening to that about how, man, those veterans, like when they're in the heat of battle, because I talk to these guys in jail. They all have PTSD and so forth. These are amazing people. And a lot of them will tell me about their battle experiences. And it's a life and death moment. Now, I've had a couple moments like that in the jail, walking into a cell, for example, where everybody's sick, throwing up blood, and I'm right there in the middle of it.
Jeez.
I had a certain instance of that in August where God literally spoke into my mind. It was not with words, it was without words. He spoke without words. It was more like a powerful, overwhelming awareness where God said, you will not get sick. Go in and preach. You have nothing to worry about. No, I was like high on God for like 3 days after this happened. So my point is that people can think whatever they want about the vaccine, pro, against, mark of the beast, not, whatever. That's all fine. But what I want to say is there's a higher reality of being high on Jesus, high on God, which sort of is beyond all this stuff, which is what everybody needs to chase after.
All right, let's go back to Walt in Pennsylvania. Walt, I'll let you finish up now that we have the pastor back.
Well, George, I don't know if the pastor heard what I said previously.
I didn't.
Did not.
You did?
Did not.
Well, it's obvious to me that the Bible and all the other holy books are replete with anthropomorphism. I don't know if you're familiar with that $15 word, but
I am.
It simply means that rather than our having been created by God, it means that we created God in our image rather than vice versa. Now, as I was telling George, and as I've said previously on shows, the most prominent anthropomorphism of all is the idea of a Messiah. I used to write a quasi newspaper column, and back in '82, I began one of my pieces in the local paper with the famous words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now, how can Jesus implore his Father to forgive the cruel men that are crucifying, and at the same time expect that this cruel sin of crucifixion can pay for the sins of mankind in general? To me, this is so obviously anthropomorphic. It's full of paradoxical irony. How can sin possibly pay for sin? This idea of suffering and bloodletting and death came from the sadomasochistic aspect of the human psyche. It came from the mind of the veritable naked ape. I like to say that Jerusalem was the Hollywood of antiquity. It's obvious that they're great stories, they're venerable stories, but they were written by the Spielbergs and the Rod Serlings and the Shakespeares of the Jewish world.
So are you saying, Walter, there's no God?
Well, obviously, George, I'm saying that the gods only exist in our imagination, whether you're talking about Yahweh, Jehovah, or Allah, or Brahma, the Hindu deity. I mean, George, science must be our religion now. Otherwise, we're not going to survive. Religions serve only to divide and confuse mankind, George, in my opinion.
All right. We're going to get your reaction to that, Jeff, when we come back, and we'll take final phone calls in a moment. Walter, you sound like an atheist. I guess you may be. So we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Jeff's website, all linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And his big book is called God Faith. We'll be back with more in a moment. On our next Coast to Coast program, we're going to be talking about UFOs, and then Mark Zicree joins us to talk about the Twilight Zone. Then we'll have those Friday night into Saturday morning open lines. Welcome back to Coast. George Norrie back with Pastor Jeff Grupp, our final segment. And Jeff, before we go to final calls, why don't you react to Walter's atheism and his thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was kind of chomping at the bit through that commercial break to answer. Okay, so first of all, I want to say that story I told about in the jail with 6 people, I never got sick. No vaccine for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
excellent.
Anyway, so to get right, so Walter's kind of hitting on really core issues here. There's a two-part response. One, he doesn't really have, in my opinion, a reason to believe unless he's had direct revelation of a faith experience, God implanting awareness of him inside of Walter. Now, that could have happened where Walter has said no, because I did a lot of that. God would do that to me. Before I became a Christian, I would say no. I would had a hard heart, a wall around my heart, and I said no. And then finally, God pummeled me over the head with a sledgehammer of his light, and then I couldn't say no anymore. There could be some of that. or, there hasn't been a revelation yet. So you really have to have that direct revelation to believe, or else Christianity may seem absurd, the cross and all that may seem a little wacky to people. I get that. I used to think that way when I was an atheist. Now, to get to his specific questions, though, about sin, the cross, and all that, and why things are like this. Now, it follows from my comment about God being perfect, and this sort of a logical principle that there's one perfect and everything else is not perfect. If you take that, and God is the one perfect, and everything that he creates is different than him, and therefore is not perfect, and therefore corrupted, as it says in 1 Corinthians 15:42, what we have then is a situation where there's a problem, that we're not like God anymore, and he needs to make himself like us. Now, Hebrews 2:17 says that since we're not like God anymore, he therefore came to earth, the God-man, Jesus, to be like us and therefore be fully human. So now we're again like God. Okay, so that's called the atonement. We've been restored to be like God again. Now, since we're like God, then we can do things that God does. We're in the image has been restored. And that, for example, he overcame death, and then secondly, he ascended into heaven. So that's the reason the cross had to happen, for him to overcome death, so therefore we could be like him and also overcome death, which, we will. Some of us are now, all of us will in the future. And then also we'll all ascend. Everybody will be raptured at some point. The Christian rapture will happen before, during the mark or before, and then there'll be the final rapture of all, at the end of the world. This kind of a complex issue. I'm kind of butchering it a little bit, but that's why it's just basically a set of logical principles of that we're created from a perfect source. We're all imperfect. There's a problem. We have to be restored. And this world is a process. Fiery trial of faith of this world is our process of restoration to be like him, to ascend. Go ahead.
Okay, my friend, let's go back to the calls. Let's go to Tony in Sacramento, California. Hi, Tony. Welcome to the show.
Hey, George. I've been listening to this for years. The first time I've been able to get in.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you did. Thank you.
Now, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. In '98, I saw a UFO. I have had experiences, like you said, where, you feel like you're just filled with light. And it came out of a show that I hope you find one time, George, and I had to do a discussion on spirituality with Art Bell and Robert Ghostwolf.
Yeah.
Right at the end, just before the break, he said 3 simple phrases, and it just lit me on fire. Anyway, I have seen ghosts. I have had lots of phenomenal experiences, including an age-old question of yours, George. Yes, I have seen behind the veil. Now, with that said, with all you've discussed with this virtual reality, the simulation, and everything else, and everybody's wondering what's behind the veil and what it has to do with this world that we see before us every day. It's like Elon Musk, I think I pronounced that right.
Yep.
And other people, or it's like trying to pick apart what the veil is. And that's my question. Is that what they're trying to do?
Well, I think that's a great question. This is something I kind of dwell on. They talks about a veil in multiple verses in the Pauline letters in the Bible about how we have a veil over us now, which God only can take away. Now, he does partially or very heavily to some people, and maybe even all people at certain moments in their lives, because God will reveal himself to all people, Romans 1:20 says. And even the person in the rainforest who's never heard the name Jesus is going to get God revealed to them. And if God wants them to know the name Jesus, he'll put it in their head. Maybe it's a different language and it sounds different, but he's going to put it in their head if he wants them to know. So the veil is something we're all subjected to. The veil is misery. And I've got a what's called a prayer room in my basement, and I often go to, and sometimes I'll focus on God so heavily that I'll almost like I can sense like this wall, this curtain. It's like right behind it is this infinite light of God, and I can almost sense the curtain. I'll say, God, can you just take the curtain away? Right now I just want to be absolutely healed by just seeing you. And we'll all have the curtain taken away at some point. And really, we just have to pray now and beg God to make us aligned with him, to take it away as much as possible now, to heal us and give us as much joy as possible now.
All right, next up, first-time caller, RB in Fontana, California. RB, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you Mr. George Norrie. It's been my dream to talk to you. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Jeff as well. Been listening by now and making great statements.
Thank you.
I would like to you guys, in case in front of a computer, laptop, or phone, just Google GURU, Guru, Nanak, Guru Nanak, Guru Nanak, Nanak. Like you can see that later, but Jeff would understand. That's my religion. It's called Sikhism. I don't know if you've ever heard about it. I'm very sure you do, because we got a lot of 7-Elevens around here. And his founding thing was Ek Onkar. It's like one God. There is only one God. He's our God, but he said there's only one God.
I think you would agree with that, Jeffrey, wouldn't you?
I mean, there's God, and then there's the sons of God. I mean, like we're sons of God. I mean, we're all sons of God in the end. You know, Job 38, 5, 6, 7, 8 talks about how when God was Yahweh, Jesus, you know, God was creating the universe. The sons of God were all cheering there. It's almost like they were seeing a different reality. Like God's creating all these infinite universes, and then here's a new one of a completely different sort, ours, and they're just cheering with incredible elation and joy over what God is doing. So, I mean, yeah, there's only one perfect creator of all things, but then there's all these creatures and angels, people, different beings and so forth described, especially in the Old Testament, that are in his image. And there's I think there's infinite of those all over the place, and we're going to interact with all those through eternity.
Let's go to Joe, Long Island, New York. Joseph, you're up.
Yeah, Jeff, I want to bring up two things, but you mentioned fire, and I was thinking of the prophet Elijah, and really that's only a picture of one person. Was chased into the desert, then the wind came, the fire came, and, you know, supposedly the Lord wasn't in the fire, wasn't in the wind, and then he was in the still small voice. But he also had birds bring him lunch. And I think all of these things were orchestrations of the Lord that were outside of him. And to say that the Lord speaks in the still small voice only, he might also speak in the fire or the storm. Or
absolutely.
You know, yeah. And my other question I want to bring up was the people that do sing hymns as unto the Lord. What do you think of that as a divine connection as well?
Hymns. That's interesting.
Well, first of all, man, I love your first point. That was something I wanted to talk about. I mean, it's really, really important that every single person listening right now knows that God is speaking inside your consciousness now. Okay, you may not know that because you're not looking at your. Let me plug a book. Pat Morley's book, The Four Voices, is kind of a simple, easy book about this. We've got cases of it that we hand out in the jail. It's amazing, you know. You've got this thing called thought in your head, and people talk. You know, I have thoughts. I'm thinking. People always talk about this. Well, who's actually going and looking at your thought? When you go and look at it, you're like, wait a minute. I'm not doing all. Well, there's all these voices and talking going in my head. I'm not doing it. Who's talking? And you look at it a little more carefully, and you can easily discern and decipher who. One is a voice of yourself, one is a voice of the devil, and another is a voice of God. And if you're tuned into these voices in your head, you will notice that God is speaking to you all the time, just like it says in the Bible, Job 33:14, among other verses. And it's just this incredibly, it's a high on God to know He's guiding you. All you have to do is reach out, cry out to Him, and speak to me, like St. Francis, would always do. Speak to me, and God does. It's miraculous. And yeah, and like the caller said, God is all-consuming fire, and He's when He the end of the world, He's come with fire. The fire is healing. Isaiah 13, I think it's verse 8, talks about how first those who are unchosen will experience the fire as like a woman hunched over in absolute misery of childbirth, of that pain, the contraction pains. But then the second half of that verse says all of a sudden they'll look at each other in amazement. Their faces are on fire. Now, I don't know about you, George, but if I'm hunched over getting burned in absolute terror of fire, I'm not going to be in a state of amazement. So there's a shift that goes on right there, where that's the baptism of fire referred to in Luke 3:6 and many other verses of the Bible, where the fire,
right.
1 Corinthians 3:14, 15, the people are saved by the fire of God.
Let's go to Jeff in Philadelphia. Get you in here, Jeffrey. Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yes. You're talking about God and the lawsuit Massey v. Pelosi talks about God and the fact that we have governors and other people that have tried to tell you how to pray, which is protected by the First Amendment.
That is a big problem, isn't it, Jeff? When government gets involved?
Yeah, take verses like Acts 4:6-26, Ezekiel 28:17, 2 Corinthians 4:4. If your listeners will look at those three verses together, you'll see that the Bible's message is that at the high echelons of power and money and government in the world, it's a satanic group that's been there for thousands of years, and their purpose of their existence is to behold and look at Satan and therefore spread terror on pretty much the rest of the world. Some listeners might not like that, but that is the message of the Bible if you look up those verses among others. And they're going to spread false messages are going to trickle down all through society. I mean, Satan is the God of information, and that's why the information is so unbelievably whacked. It says in Romans 3:4 and Psalm 116:11 that people are liars. So unless God is speaking through people are lying, and that's where you get all over the place. So if you want to listen to a politician tell you how to pray, you don't need anybody. You only have one. 1 John 2:27 says you only have one teacher, and that is the anointing from Christ to you, and that's where you learn how to pray. He's reaching out to you now, and you simply open your heart with everything, open yourself to Him, and interact with Him, and then you'll just automatically, He'll pray you. He'll do the job for you.
Jeff, with just about a minute left, I'd like you to wrap things up by telling people, of course, where they can get your books, your website, and final words.
Yeah, it's a big honor, George, to be with this audience, and this is a big audience. And my website is praiseandlove.net. You can get to my LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, everything's there. Books, and there's all kinds of free stuff all over the place, and a lot of it's new information. It's all just right from Scripture and from spiritual high. That's the whole point. And just really thank all these listeners and for having a big heart and openness to want to know the truth.
And if there's somebody on the fence trying to hold back, thinking about whether there's a God or not, what's the best thing they can do to be a believer?
John 17:3 and Acts 16:31 mix the two verses together, and you realize that you have to believe in everything with no doubt that there's a creator, Jesus, God, that is here now inside you all over the place. Simply look directly at Him in perfect, doubtless belief, and if you do that, eventually that you will see Him and sense Him everywhere, and then you will be on your mission. Then you will have your purpose, and then you will wonder what you were doing with your life before that.
Does it come at you like a light?
Yeah, sometimes, definitely, just like Paul in Damascus Road in Acts 9.
All right, my friend. Thanks again, Jeff, for being on the program. Keep in touch with us, all right?
You bet.
He is a pastor at a jail in Michigan. Isn't that amazing? And we've got a lot of people in jail that listen to this program. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Jeremiah Harris, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesor, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, Tim Banal, George Knapp, and Ian Punnett. I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.